Hello everyone and welcome back to AP Bio with AP Playground. Today we're covering topic 7.4, Population Genetics. Bit of a longer lesson today, but we'll be discussing evolution driven by random occurrences that are not natural selection, changes in allele frequencies, and the role of random processes in the evolution of specific populations. And our suggested skill is questions and methods. 3B, state the null hypothesis or predict the results of an experiment. First up, allele frequency. And an allele frequency is going to be how frequent an allele appears in a population. And a population is going to be a group of individuals of a species that live together and interbreed. And this whole subunit is about population genetics. And so if the allele frequency in a population changes, if the number of dominant and heterozygous alleles shift, that means that evolution has occurred. The genetic makeup of the population has changed. And so you can see the allele frequency of a certain allele by counting the number of copies of an allele and dividing them by the total population. So in the first generation here, we can see that for the dominant allele, there was a 0.5 frequency. So there was half of the individuals had the dominant allele. And the dominant allele made up half of the whole population, and also half had the recessive allele. But after target by predators, there was a lot less individuals that had the recessive allele, and as a result, the allele frequency of the dominant allele increased to 0.7, while the recessive allele frequency decreased to 0.3. And eventually, in the third generation, the dominant allele frequency went up to 0.9, while the recessive allele frequency decreased to 0.1. So we can see that the allele frequencies add up to 1, they make up the whole population, and if there is change in the allele frequency, that means that evolution has occurred. So we'll start by talking about population distribution. And so populations can be distributed due to selection. So when we look at the traits in a population, we can have disruptive selection where the extreme traits are selected for. Maybe if we're looking at bird beaks, birds that have a medium-sized beak, it's not helpful to them in the environment. Only having small and large beaks are helpful. And so the selection of traits has moved outward to the extremes. There's stabilizing selection where maybe the trait in the middle is helpful. For instance, baby weight. Having an average baby weight means that you have a higher chance to survive and reproduce, and so selection moves towards that middle trait. And lastly, we have directional selection, where there's moving in a specific shift, neither to the extremes or the middle, but a certain trait. So for instance, if there's a group of mice and some have the color that allows them to be camouflaged into the environment, then those are the mice that are going to be able to survive and reproduce, and so there's going to be selection in the direction of that camouflaging color. And oftentimes people will ask, well, if their natural selection does happen and populations change over time, why do unfavorable alleles just stop being selected in the population, and as a result they're no longer part of the gene pool, they're no longer part of the alleles in the population? But variation is preserved within populations, and favorable alleles are not always selected against, or they can hide. For instance, recessive alleles are hidden in heterozygous individuals. So even though the recessive trait might not be beneficial to surviving in that environment, the fact that we have heterozygous individuals that can be carriers for a trait and still survive and reproduce means that those recessive alleles have a chance of being passed down. Additionally, there's balancing selection where a mix of alleles is favored, and we have heterozygote advantage as we see in sickle cell anemia, where those that are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia, they do have some sickled blood cells that block blood flow, but they also have increased resistance against malaria. So the heterozygous individuals are able to survive and reproduce and pass down their heterozygous genes, and so as a result, some offspring may get 2 recessive alleles for sickle cell anemia, but there is a heterozygote advantage there. Additionally, we have frequency-dependent selection, where success of a trait is based on how common it is within the population. So the ability for an individual to survive and reproduce changes based on how common a certain trait is within the population. For instance, if more individuals in the population have coloration of like warning colors, then that's going to increase the survival of the individuals and the population as a whole, because these warning colors are going to signal to predators that they should not try to mess with those individuals. Now we're going to discuss how evolution can occur without natural selection. So natural selection is certainly one of the ways that evolution can occur, but there are also random methods for evolution, such as mutations. And mutations add genetic variation to a population randomly, and they provide extra variation that natural selection can act on. And they're the only source of creating new genes. And so when a mutation creates variation, then the unfavorable mutations are selected against, and then the favorable mutations are going to allow individuals to more likely to survive and reproduce within an environment. So even though natural selection isn't the only form of evolution, because it's not a random process, it's a selective process. Random processes such as mutations can contribute to natural selection and allow for the introduction of new genes into a population, and as a result, evolution. We also have genetic drift, which is the unpredictable fluctuation in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. So it's non-selective, it's random. And genetic drift has a higher chance to happen in smaller populations because there's not as much variety to begin with. And this can lower genetic diversity, which is going to have repercussions when that means that this population may not be able to survive environmental changes as well, because there are not so many traits for natural selection to act on. So an example of genetic drift is founder effect, where a few individuals become isolated from the larger population and establish a new population. So as we can see here, the parent population has all of these gray and orange butterflies, and after the founder effect, a group could be separated, and this group could be a new population that has different allele frequency. This group, for instance, only has gray butterflies. So founder effect can reduce genetic diversity and also changes the allele frequency within a population. We also have bottleneck effect, where a sudden change in the environment drastically reduces the size of a population. So the population has gone through the neck of a bottle, the skinny part of the bottle, and after a bottleneck event that can drastically change the environment, then the surviving population is not going to represent the entire original population. It's only going to represent a part of that population. So as you can see here, we have the original population of yellow, green, and red marbles. But after the bottleneck effect, the surviving population is primarily red and green marbles. The yellow marbles didn't really survive the bottleneck effect, and this is not because they were less adapted to the environment. This is just because of this drastic environmental change, for instance, like a forest fire or something, that caused this bottleneck effect to happen. And now the new population, the phenotypes in the new population, do not reflect the phenotypes in the old population. We also have gene flow, where genes flow from one population to another when a population loses or gains alleles by genetic subtractions or additions. And this generally happens through migration, and this will actually reduce genetic differences between populations. So for instance, if this brown beetle migrates over and joins our green beetles over here, then now the genes of this brown beetle have been introduced into the population, and as reproduction begins, this population is going to start looking more like the population of brown beetles. And so genes have been added to the population, but this was completely random. This is just migration that occurred. The beetle just decided to go join its new population. Now, this is another selective process of evolution that isn't natural selection, but it's not random either, and this is sexual selection. And this is a form of natural selection in which individuals with certain inherited characteristics are more likely than other individuals to obtain mates. So while natural selection is all about surviving and reproducing, this is specifically about the ability to obtain a mate. And so this leads to sexual dimorphism. So it's not enough for the person, for the organism to have the correct sexual organs. There has to be a variation of secondary sexual traits, and some provide an advantage over others, such as the size of the individual, the color, the behavior. And so we can look at peacocks, for instance. When they're trying to attract peahens, they have to have the largest flare-up in their feathers, and if they have the largest flare-up, they're the most attractive peacock, then they will be selected by the peahen as a mate. So this is sexual selection in play over here. And so when we're reviewing population genetics, we have to remember that populations change over time, the allele frequency shifts, and this can happen to natural selection, yes, but it can also happen due to random factors such as genetic drift and gene flow and mutations, and also sexual selection. This was 7.4 population genetics. We'll see you in 7.5 to discuss Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium.